Sonnet 20 is such a fun sonnet to read because it's so playful about gender and sexuality, and it's actually kind of surprising. So most people, you might have clicked on this video because you read the poem and are kind of shocked by what is in it. So in this video, we're going to talk about some of the formal features as well as some of the contextual questions that get raised by people who are reading this poem for the first time. So something to note about placing this in context within the larger corpus of Shakespeare's sonnets is that this is within the subgenre or the subcycle of sonnets called the young man sonnets. So sonnets 1 through 17 typically were all about persuading the young man to marry, but then somewhere around sonnet 15, sonnet 17, things began to change, and the narrator in these poems seems to no longer, his advice used to be, in sonnets 1 through 17, tend to be propagate and have children so beauty will continue. Well, the argument then changes. He says, these lines, my verse, will give you immortality. So he's still talking to a young man, persuading him to marry in the first 17, but then something changes right about here where now he's talking about the way to keep your beauty is through my poetry, really. But here in Sonnet 20, he addresses a young man who is praised for beautiful and feminine features. So this is kind of strange. Some people have thought, well, is this homoerotic? Some people have thought, is he just being witty? We're going to get into that. But first, let's do a line-by-line analysis here. Starting with the octet, which is the first 8 lines, we're going to take this octet and sestet. There's the octet here. A woman's face with nature's own painted hand hast thou, the master mistress of my passion, addressing the young man as master mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change, as is false woman's fashion. So the young man is compared to a woman. He has a woman's face. He is the master mistress of the narrator's passion, and he has a woman's heart with one exception. It's more true than a woman's heart, and here we have some sexism. But in the next lines, he compares his eye, less false than theirs. He goes on with this comparison. An eye more bright than theirs, meaning women's, less false in rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth, meaning that whatever his eye looks upon turns to gold or is gilded. A man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. So we have this, I just want to draw your attention here to the hues. The H typically was silent, so this sounded like you. And here, so a man in you, all use in his controlling, and there's a pun there on use and hues, and the double meaning of hue as well as a color. And this hue steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. So he gets attention from both men and women here. So in the sestet, the narrator moves into kind of the creation story of this young man. We see him created originally as a woman, but nature fell in love with her own creation. So nature, usually personified as female, changes him into a man so that she could love him. And by addition, so let's start here. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature as she wrought thee fell a doting. And by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. What is the one thing that nature adds to make this woman a man? Well, I'm sure you can guess. He tells us in this pun within the couplet, but since she pricked thee out for woman's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use, their treasure. And here again we have use, which again phonetically sounds very much like use, as it would have been pronounced in Shakespeare's day. So we've got the pun pricked, which is a joke on male anatomy, and that word use again, which calls back to the hues in line 7. Now, a really, really good reading of this is Helen Vendler's couple pages that she's written on Sonnet 20. And she notices that in almost every line of this poem contains the letters to spell the word hues or hue. So either this or that. We've got these letters in every line. So this has led some to wonder whether the young man is a real person that Shakespeare might have known, or is someone who might have been named Hugh. And Oscar Wilde has written a big theory about this. It's very entertaining in a short story called The Portrait of W.H. So check that out. But this is really a clever sonnet for a number of reasons. Let's talk about the formal features, for instance, which we really haven't done. We've been dealing with the content, which kind of overshadows the formal features sometimes. We've got some beautiful musical qualities to this lyric, as typical of Shakespeare. But we also have double rhymes, sometimes called feminine rhymes. Now, a feminine or a double rhyme was a rhyme that rhymed with both of its syllables instead of just the stressed syllable at the end. So, painted, acquainted, passion, fashion. So that you see how those two vowels within the word both rhyme. Now, they're called weak rhymes because it's typically, it's a strong rhyme if it just rhymes on the stressed syllable. But a double rhyme was weak. And why is it called feminine? Sexism, basically. So the question, though, of homoeroticism comes up in discussions about this poem quite a bit, because the narrator, who is clearly a male, explores having desires and affection towards this young man. So the question whether this sonnet is homoerotic is kind of difficult to answer. The narrator does express attraction towards a young man, but it's only by the feminine features of that young man. The octet imagines nature changing the creation of the woman by adding one thing, but allows the face to remain the same. Now, does this mean that Shakespeare was gay? This is kind of a question that comes up. It's not really like an interesting question to me. It's kind of like the question, was Shakespeare a Catholic or was he, a Protestant? It doesn't really matter for this poem because the narrator isn't necessarily Shakespeare. And we can't answer the question with this sonnet. So the literary critic in me says, it doesn't really matter. It's not of concern here. For one thing, the difference between the narrator and the sonnet, like I mentioned, and the poet of the sonnet, usually two different identities. And the other thing is that the homoerotic overtones are diluted by this couplet. You see, because the narrator makes the young man the object of woman's love rather than his own. Also, since the sonnets were popular during this period, sonnet writers were looking for ways to be surprising and inventive. Since most sonnets were written for women by men, this sonnet, which addresses a young man rather than a woman, is kind of inventive and new. And this is Helen Vendler's take on this as well. So in sum, this is basically an exercise in wit. He's being clever and kind of shocking here, more than it is about the poet's own sexuality. But that doesn't make this sonnet any less interesting. There's definitely more to mention here regarding the imagery of this gilding eye, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth, and of this kind of creation story and the larger genre of that within literature. But for now, I hope this gives you some insight into the sonnet, as well as some of the questions that usually come up about it. If you have a different theory, definitely post it below. If you notice anything else that didn't get mentioned, do mention that. And thanks for joining me, and until next time.